It was upon a damp November evening, with a chill mist creeping along Baker Street like a living thing, that Holmes tossed aside the Persian slipper and the violin in a single disdainful motion and fixed his gaze upon the window where the street lamps smeared their light against the fog. He had been silent for half an hour, only the thin blue thread of his cigarette giving any sign of life. I had begun to think his thoughts were wandering in those remote mathematical regions where, from time to time, he sought descanso for his formidable mind, when a sharp rap, two short, one long, sounded at our door. "Lestrade," said Holmes without turning his head. "He carries a draft in his left sleeve, which rattles when he lifts his hand. The pattern of impatience is unmistakable." Our landlady ushered in the inspector, his keen face made keener by the cold and a pale halo of damp about his hat. He bore in one hand a dark tin box and in the other a crumpled telegram. "Evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor," he nodded. "I've something singular, and I say it who have seen my share of singularities." He laid the telegram upon our table. Holmes read it off in a flat tone that somehow heightened its urgency. "Gentleman found dead, study locked within. No marks of violence. Candle oddly melted. Servants swear to hearing nothing. Come at once. J. Bracken, steward, Darnaway House, Knightsbridge." Holmes looked up. "Oddly melted?" "That's not the half of it," said Lestrade, tapping the tin box. "I brought the candle." Holmes's eyes brightened, and he cleared a space upon the table with one sweep of his lean hand. "Set it there, if you please." Lestrade removed the lid with a little ceremony and produced a stout length of beeswax, its stub blackened and warped in a curious asymmetry. The wick rose like a crooked finger arrested mid-gesture, and the wax about it had fallen into tight ripples, as though a pond had been struck and frozen in an instant before the rings could spread. "It remembers," murmured Holmes. "What remembers?" asked I, feeling a foolishness in the question even as it left my lips. "The air, Watson, or rather the manner in which the air was disturbed. This candle has recorded it. You see these ridges? Too regular for clumsy handling, too abrupt for heat alone. Think of a violin string struck and left to quiver. The wax is such a string, only its vibrations are those of air. If one could hear with one's eyes, these folds would be an echo." Lestrade scoffed, though not unkindly. "That may be as it will. The facts are these. Sir Alistair Darnaway, baronet and barrister, was found at 9 o'clock this evening in his study at Darnaway House. Door locked on the inside, key in his pocket, windows fastened and barred. He was seated at his desk, head fallen upon his arms, a pen in his hand and a blot on the paper, such as happens when a man drops suddenly asleep, only he was as dead as Westminster stone. No wound, no poison we can find. The fire had burned low. That candle," he jerked his chin at the grotesque relic, "stood upon the desk and looked as you see it. The servants swear they heard no cry, but Sir Alistair was seen alive by his valet at 8:30, and there's no other exit." "And the paper?" Holmes asked. "Blotted beyond legibility. The ink soaked the fibres and, well—" Lestrade glanced at me, as though penmanship might fall within a medical man's province. "We sent it with a boy to the yard to dry under a glass. You shall have it when it yields anything." Holmes rose with a movement of decision which never failed to stir my own blood. "Your cab is below?" "It is." "Then the case is already late." He clapped his hat upon his head and thrust the strange candle into his pocket with a delicacy that belied the haste of the act. "Come, Watson, the night is ill, and that is often when truth keeps her appointments." Knightsbridge lay wrapped in a vapour that drew the world close and muffled it. so that our wheels seemed to roll through velvet and the horse's breath to hang in white plumes, each exhalation a ghost. Darnaway House, when we reached it, showed a faint rectangle of light in the upper story and a knot of curious loafers on the pavement, whom Lestrade scattered with a word. Within, the butler received us with that mixture of shock and propriety which is the special province of his class, and led us across marble that caught our footsteps into a library of sober oak and sober volumes where the air had a chill that no fire could altogether banish. Sir Alistair Darnaway still sat at his desk. Death had touched him with so gentle a hand that but for the faint greying of the lips and a tightness at the corners of the eyes, one might have supposed him engaged upon some taxing brief and resting a moment before beginning again. I could not withhold a swift exclamation of pity. He had the lined brow of the man who has listened to many troubles and the clean-lipped gravity of one who has judged them not unkindly. Holmes bowed slightly to the dead, as he always did, then circled the room in a slow spiral that drew him nearer and nearer to the desk. He paused at the hearth, where a lattice of pale ash spoke of a coal fire lately damped, at a glass-fronted cabinet, where the glint of silver caught his attention, at last, before a tall candlestick upon which only a smear of wax remained, the twin, it seemed, to that which lay in Holmes's pocket. 2 candles were lit, he said softly. One burned steady, one did not. He pointed to the wall where, above the desk, the oil portrait of a lady, perhaps Sir Alister's late wife, had been taken down and stood now upon the floor, leaning against the wainscot. Behind it, the wallpaper showed an oblong of cleaner tone, and upon that fairer square a faint sooting, like smoke, brushed by a careful hand into a shape at once. Delicate and grotesque, a ladder of little dark rungs slanting upward. The candle's memory, Holmes observed, and there his long finger indicated a half-inch nick at the frame's inner edge, evidence of recent removal. Why take down a portrait for a quiet evening study? Lestrade bristled. A man tidies his walls, he does not necessarily— Holmes silenced him with that courteous firmness which even the Yard had learned to obey. He bent over the desk. Watson, your eye, what do you make of the skin about the nostrils and mouth? I examined the face. Slight pallor, a hint of lividity in the lips, but no staining of the teeth or tongue that I can see, and no odour. The pupils are no more than moderately dilated. Precisely, said Holmes. Had there been prussic acid or the like, our noses would have told us before our eyes had done with the man. Gentlemen, the cause of death does not flaunt itself. It is modest. Modesty kills as efficiently as vulgarity, given the proper apparatus. He crossed to the window. The iron bars were cold under his fingers, and the catch secure. He knelt and drew his lens along the sill. Dust undisturbed, yet, observe this imperceptible crescent in the dust line. Something round was set here and removed. Recently. Lestrade joined him, frowning. A vase. Too small. An earpiece, perhaps, or a tube end. He let the sash fall back into place. Sir Alister was a barrister accustomed to contest. He had an enemy, as what man who draws a boundary does not? But here is an enemy who understands rooms, Watson. He understands air. Holmes moved again to the hearth and crouched so low that the ash traced a pale moustache upon his trouser knee. He breathed out softly across the grate, and a tremulous ripple passed through the ash, revealing beneath a pattern of darker flakes in 2 converging lines. Draughts, he murmured. They have paths like footfalls. One from the window, natural enough. Another from— where? He turned, and his glance lit upon a narrow oak door set flush with the panelling. The butler, who had hovered with decent ignorance, spoke at last. That, sir, is a small closet where Sir Alistair kept his deeds and a tin of cigars. "Open it, if you please," the butler faltered. "It is locked." Holmes's mouth twitched. "Then the key?" "In Sir Alistair's pocket, sir, with the others, but I confess—" He broke off, flustered. Holmes retrieved a little chamois roll from his coat and, in a moment's legerdemain which always made me feel a respectable admiration, wrestled with a faint moral scruple. The lock yielded. The closet was no more than a shallow recess with shelves. Upon one lay a metal cylinder suited to maps. Upon another, a black velvet pouch, and at the back, this I saw plainly when Holmes swept his lamp within, an aperture the size of a crown piece, neatly cut, leading into the blind space between wall and chimney. Holmes did not touch it. He only smiled, that thin smile which is not unkindly but which tells a man that his adversary's sport is nearly done. "An ear for the house," he said, "and perhaps a mouth." Lestrade had grown impatient. "Mouthed epitaphs don't handcuff men, Mr. Holmes. Give me something I can take back to the yard." "You shall have it," said Holmes. He slipped the warped candle back upon the desk beside its quietly burned twin, and for an instant the grotesque little thing seemed to shiver in the lamplight, as though recalling again some agitation of the air no human ear had marked. "For now, understand this. There was a scream in this room tonight, a scream so sudden that it rippled wax, and yet no servant heard it. The house heard it." His hand indicated the aperture in the wall. Someone arranged to swallow the sound. He straightened, all indolence fallen from him, and the hawk had come into his face. "We will need the valet, the steward, and the butler in turn. We will need Sir Alistair's last brief and a candle-maker. Yes, a candle-maker. And a quiet hour in which to listen to the house, as one listens to a convalescent's chest. The case appears impossible to the average person because the average person thinks only with his eyes. Tonight, gentlemen, we shall think with the candle." Holmes's mind, as always, moved with a precision that outstripped any ordinary notion of time, and I found myself struggling to keep pace as he led us back down the narrow stairwell toward the main corridor of Darnaway House. The fog of the London night, which had seemed merely a poetic inconvenience, now took on the character of a conspirator, hiding every silhouette and muffling every footstep. Lestrade trudged behind, his patience already fraying, muttering faintly about the unreasonably delicate nature of the investigation. "It's a death, Mr. Holmes," he said. "And yet you measure the air as if it were a violin string. Can't we just look for prints, or—" Holmes stopped short, pivoting with that lithe grace of his, and fixed Lestrade with a glance that brooked no interruption. "Scotland Yard excels at what it excels at, Lestrade, but the devil lies in subtleties that require not force but perception. Prints are indeed useful, yet air itself may betray the culprit when human hands leave nothing more tangible. Observe carefully, there are patterns that ink and leather cannot replicate." I, of course, followed his lead, though my mind was still occupied with the strange wax relic he had carried from the library. That candle, so innocuous in appearance, yet so pregnant with secrets, seemed almost a talisman of a hidden logic, a logic that would, I feared, reveal itself in increments only Holmes could read in its entirety. The way he pocketed it, handled it, and all but caressed its warped form suggested an intimacy with phenomena most men would dismiss as mere curiosities. Upon reaching the library once more, Holmes turned first to the aperture behind the removed portrait. His long fingers traced the edges lightly, as though reading Braille, and he seemed to measure the thickness of the wall and the air beyond. I could not help but shiver, realizing that we were entering a domain that was part house, part trap, and entirely cunning. The house itself, he murmured, is an accomplice, Watson. It is silent, yet it speaks if you know how to hear it. Lestrade, ever the sceptic, frowned at the wall. A talking house now, is it? Perhaps the next time, Mr. Holmes, we shall require it to provide testimony in open court. Holmes ignored the barb. Watson, note the angles of the aperture. They are deliberately cut to a precise width, narrow enough to transmit sound, wide enough to admit a slender cylinder. This is no accident, no whimsy of the deceased's private curiosity. It is engineered in secret for a purpose. I followed his reasoning with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. The more Holmes spoke, the more I realized how many layers lay behind a scene that to ordinary eyes would appear straightforward. A locked study, a man dead without mark, a candle oddly warped. The misdirection was precise, and yet, as always, Holmes had a map in his mind that traced paths invisible to all others. Holmes moved then to the desk, crouching with an intensity that made the aged wood groan under his elbows. He examined the blotched paper with a careful lens, his fingers moving with nimble caution. The ink, he said finally, absorbed into the fibres in a manner suggesting haste or disturbance. But it is not random. The blot is not mere accident. It tells us that the hand which wrote was interrupted, startled, or otherwise forced into unnatural motion. His eyes narrowed. Yet the blot is not caused by terror alone. No, the cause is physical, Watson, a sudden draught perhaps, or the manipulation of some device. Lestrade looked on, bewildered. A device, you say? What sort of device could have killed a man so quietly, leaving not so much as a stain upon the mouth or throat? Holmes allowed himself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Not what it leaves upon the body, but what it leaves upon the air and the objects around it, Lestrade. The candle has spoken. Its ripples are an imprint of that which occurred. One must only know how to read them. I followed him as he moved around the room, examining each object with methodical care. The fire had burned low, leaving only a gentle warmth and the fine traces of ash across the hearth. He examined the ash as if it were a puzzle, noting patterns invisible to my untrained eyes. Footsteps, he said softly, more to himself than to either of us. Yes, but not many. One or two, taken with circumspection, and perhaps someone who knew the house well enough to avoid the usual squeaks of floorboards. He turned, then, to the silver cabinet. Here, he murmured, tapping the glass with a delicate knuckle. Observe the fingerprints, if one can call them such. Smudged, blurred, yet deliberate. A hand traced a path, pausing here and there. Why? To mislead, or to recover something unseen? Lestrade made a derisive noise. We have servants and a valet. Perhaps they brushed against it in ordinary use. Holmes shook his head with gentle impatience. Ordinary use does not create such precision. Observe, Watson, the powder left a crescent mark, interrupted only at precise intervals. A hand, yes, but one acting under extraordinary guidance, fear, anticipation, calculation. He leaned close to my ear. And if you add this to the candle's memory and the aperture behind the portrait, the air in this room becomes a ledger. Every vibration, every movement has been recorded. One need only read it. I felt a shiver of recognition. Holmes's logic was absolute, yet so delicate. It required a mind capable of reading the invisible, of sensing connections between disparate, even contradictory phenomena. He crouched by the hearth again, tilting his head and listening to the faint echoes that seemed to bounce off the walls. The scream, he said at last, did not vanish, it travelled. It was swallowed and redirected. The mechanism is subtle, yet effective, and yet there is one flaw. Lestrade leaned closer. A flaw, Holmes? After all this, you have found a flaw? Holmes's eyes sparkled. Indeed, a flaw small but illuminating. The air betrays haste at a single point, Watson, here. He indicated the corner where the wall met the floorboards. The engineer underestimated the turbulence created by the removal of the portrait. The scream, though swallowed, left a trace. That trace is faint, but it exists. I realized then that Holmes had been measuring, sensing, reading the room as one might read a musical score. Every object, every shadow, every disturbance of dust and wax and paper formed a network of evidence invisible to the casual observer. Holmes rose, placing the warped candle upon the desk once more. The next step, gentlemen, is to understand the sequence of actions, not merely the death itself, but the manipulation of sound, air, and object that preceded it. We must speak with the servants. We must understand the habits of Sir Alister and those who had access to him, and we must consult a candlemaker, one who can read the wax as one reads a book. Lestrade muttered, "A candlemaker? Really, Holmes?" "Indeed, Lestrade. The candle is witness and messenger, perhaps the only one who truly saw what occurred." He pocketed his lens and adjusted his coat. "Watson, I fear our night is only beginning. The house holds secrets, yes, but so too do those who dwell within it, and one of them, I suspect, will attempt to mislead us if given half the chance." I could not deny the thrill that ran through me, even as the fog pressed against the windows, and the house whispered in tones that only Holmes could hear. The investigation had shifted from mere death to a delicate game of precision and subtlety, and I realized that we were about to enter the realm where the ordinary rules of evidence no longer applied. Every shadow, every ripple of wax, every trace of air could be a clue or a misdirection, and Holmes was already moving, steps ahead, in a world I barely comprehended. As we prepared to question the valet and then the steward, I understood that this was no ordinary murder. The candle had remembered the scream, but it had not yet revealed the hand that orchestrated it. And Holmes, as always, was poised to read its story where others saw only chaos. The night stretched before us, dense and unyielding, but within it a path, narrow, precise, and illuminated by the subtle logic of a singular mind, awaited discovery. The valet, a pale and nervous man named Higgins, awaited us in the corner of the drawing-room, his posture that of a man expecting reprimand, but uncertain for what. Holmes's eyes swept the room in a practised arc, noting the angle of the curtains, the slight unevenness of the carpet near the hearth, and the subtle scuff marks by the door-frame, details that to any ordinary observer would have been dismissed as trivial, but which to Holmes suggested patterns of movement, habits of service, and perhaps moments of hurried concealment. "Come forward, Mr. Higgins," he said gently. "We are here to understand the evening's occurrences, not to accuse at this stage." Higgins swallowed audibly and began his account, his voice low and hesitant. He spoke of Sir Alister's manner during the evening, noting the baronet's unusual preoccupation with correspondence and the careful lighting of his study candles. "He always preferred the tall candle near the desk lit first, sir," Higgins added, "and the smaller one near the portrait only afterwards. But tonight—" His eyes flickered nervously toward the portrait, now replaced upon the floor against the wainscot. "Tonight he adjusted the portrait himself, sir, before the light was extinguished. He seemed troubled." Holmes nodded, his long fingers steepling together as he listened. "Troubled how, Higgins?" "I cannot say precisely, sir," he murmured to himself and paused often. And there was a draught, unusual in the room. I thought perhaps a window had been left open, but when I checked, all was secured as usual. It was as if the air moved against itself. Lestrade muttered, "That's hardly helpful, Higgins. Draughts are common in old houses." Holmes's gaze, sharp and unyielding, met the inspector's. And yet, Lestrade, in combination with the candle's wax and the aperture behind the portrait, such a draught is anything but ordinary. It is deliberate. He turned to Higgins again. Tell me of the moment you last saw Sir Alistair alive. The valet's hands trembled slightly as he recalled the details. It was shortly after 8:30. He had finished reviewing a document, sir, and I brought him a fresh candle from the cabinet. He thanked me, and I thought him merely contemplative. Then he seated himself at his desk, placed the candle on the left side, and returned to his writing. I left to attend to the fire. Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. And the brief blot you mentioned earlier, Watson? Did Higgins witness that? Only the general activity, Mr. Holmes, I replied. He did not note the interruption or any peculiar smudge. He merely saw Sir Alistair poised over the paper. Precisely, Holmes said. We shall see how the hand trembled, how the wax responded, and how the air remembered the sound that no human ear caught. But first the steward, Bracken. He has intimate knowledge of the household's operations. He will tell us who could access the study at any hour and whether any unusual arrangements were made in the days prior. Bracken, a man of measured tone and deliberate speech, joined us shortly, accompanied by the butler, an older man named Fenwick, who maintained a stoic air, as though the gravity of a death in his house were both tragic and inevitable. Bracken began with the household routines, enumerating the times candles were lit and extinguished, the manner in which windows were opened or closed, and the precise handling of valuable documents and correspondence. No one but the valet, myself, and Sir Alistair ever had keys to the study, Bracken explained, and Sir Alistair was meticulous about locking the room when unattended. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And yet the evidence suggests that someone entered, or caused an effect, without using the conventional entry points. The candle's memory, as I have described, indicates a disturbance in the air sufficient to unsettle wax and paper alike. Let us consider who among you possesses both opportunity and knowledge to manipulate such subtleties. Fenwick's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanour unshaken, but I could sense the tension coiling beneath. Holmes moved around him with characteristic agility, pausing to note a minor nick in the cuff of the butler's sleeve, as though it might correspond to a recent task. The smallest marks often reveal more than the grandest gestures, Holmes murmured. Observe how the nick aligns with the direction of air currents near the desk. Mere coincidence or preparation for something more deliberate? Lestrade snorted. You're reading Ghosts in the Wax again, Holmes? Facts, man, facts. Holmes ignored him and crouched by the desk once more, studying the wax in tandem with the candle stub he had carried. Notice, Watson, the ripples in the wax are concentric, yet they tilt slightly toward the left side. That direction corresponds to the initial orientation of the smaller candle near the portrait. The disruption suggests that a sudden force, possibly a shriek or abrupt gesture, originated from this position and travelled along a vector amplified by the aperture behind the portrait. The scream, or sound thereof, was conducted not to frighten but to serve as a signal or misdirection. I felt a chill at the realization. So, Sir Alistair may have been startled, yes, but the death itself was engineered around this orchestration of air and sound. Exactly, Watson, Holmes replied. The death is not brute force nor simple poison. It is subtle, intellectual, like the hand of a mathematician solving an intricate problem. Each movement, each arrangement, each placement of candle and furniture contributes to a sequence that to ordinary observers is invisible. Yet the traces remain for those who know how to read them. He rose and moved toward the window, drawing aside the curtain to examine the faint outline of the city beyond. The gaslights cast elongated shadows across the room, and I could almost see him measuring the angles, calculating the paths by which sound and air could be channeled with precision. Every house has its idiosyncrasies, Watson. Doors squeak, floorboards settle, air currents shift. One who understands these nuances can orchestrate events within it without leaving a conventional footprint. And in such a house, the candle is a witness, the walls a ledger, and even the shadows a testimony. Lestrade rubbed his forehead. And all this from a candle and a whisper of air. I never ceased to be amazed at how you weave the invisible into some grand puzzle, Holmes. Holmes's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The grand puzzle is always there, Lestrade. It is only the observer who lacks the eyes to see it. Watson, prepare to examine the cylinders and documents Sir Alistair possessed. We shall need to understand his last movements, his intentions, and the context in which the house was manipulated. Then, and only then, shall we approach a hypothesis that can withstand scrutiny. I felt a surge of anticipation. The case had shifted from a perplexing death to a labyrinthine problem of subtle manipulation, invisible forces, and deliberate orchestration. Every servant, every officer, every artifact in the room could contribute a piece to the puzzle. And Holmes, as always, moved several steps ahead, his mind already tracing lines invisible to the rest of us. As he gestured for Higgins and Bracken to join him near the desk, I understood that the first stage of the investigation, the observation, the measurement, the silent collection of data, was complete. What remained was to unravel the web hidden within a house that remembered its sounds and a candle that preserved the echoes of a scream, and to follow Holmes as he navigated these layers of deception with a clarity that seemed almost supernatural. The night had grown deeper, the fog thicker, yet within the walls of Darnaway House, a silent and meticulous game was beginning, one in which intellect, precision, and observation would decide the truth. The candle flame trembled faintly as Holmes leaned over the desk, his features sharpened by its glow. It was near midnight now, and the air within the study felt charged, thick with expectation, as though the house itself strained to listen. Higgins and Bracken had been dismissed for the moment, leaving only Holmes, Lestrade, and myself. The silence was so deep that even the slow ticking of the mantel clock seemed intrusive. Holmes's eyes, bright and distant, remained fixed on the warped candle. He had been staring for several minutes without speaking, and I knew better than to interrupt his thoughts. At length he murmured, "Watson, imagine a whisper, faint, precise, carried through the bones of the house. It does not vanish, it travels, finding passage through hollows, gaps, vents. That whisper, magnified or redirected, can become a weapon." I hesitated. "A weapon, Holmes? Sound alone cannot kill." "Not in its common form," he said, his voice soft yet cutting through the stillness. "But suppose, my dear Watson, that the sound is a byproduct, a symptom of something more deliberate, a reaction triggered not by what one hears, but by what one breathes." He looked toward the portrait, its face turned toward the wall. "The aperture concealed behind that painting is not only a conduit for sound, it may serve another, deadlier purpose." Lestrade, who had been pacing impatiently, stopped short. "Now you're suggesting the man was murdered by the wall itself, Holmes? Poisoned air, perhaps?" Holmes's smile was faint but approving. "Closer than you realize, Lestrade. Poisoned air indeed, or rather, a precise application of vapour. Sir Alistair's death bore no signs of violence nor any mark of common toxins. But if one were to channel a subtle gas, odourless, fleeting, confined to a single draught, then death could come silently, leaving little trace save for the faintest constriction of the lungs and the confusion of the senses. The scream we did not hear, Watson, May have been no human sound at all, but the sudden exhalation of released gas through that hidden channel. I felt a chill course through me. Then the candle's strange shape. Precisely, Holmes interrupted, his eyes gleaming. The wax recorded the disturbance caused by that very emission. A sudden rush of compressed air would ripple the flame, freeze the wax in waves, and extinguish the weaker candle. The second remained steady because it was placed just outside the current's reach. Ingenious. The murderer, Watson, is no common criminal. He is a mechanist of rare talent. Lestrade frowned. You mean to say some contraption killed the man from behind the wall? That someone built such a thing in this house? Holmes began pacing, his lean frame cutting shadows across the room. A mechanism, yes, small, concealed, efficient. I suspect the cylinder we found in the closet was part of it. Bracken mentioned that it was used to store maps, did he not? Yet the dust upon its rim differs from that of its surroundings. It has been handled recently, but not by Sir Alister. He was a man of habit, one whose orderliness was near obsessive. The disturbance, the candle, the aperture, all point to a deliberate orchestration. Someone within this house understood both its structure and his habits intimately. Then one of the servants? I ventured. Holmes shook his head slowly. Perhaps, but do not fall into the convenient trap of the obvious, my dear fellow. Servants see much, yes, but rarely possess the ingenuity for such precise engineering. No, this bears the mark of intellect, an educated adversary, one who hides cunning behind respectability. We must inquire not into the lives of those beneath Sir Alister, but those beside him. Lestrade snorted. You mean one of his peers, a friend? A colleague, perhaps, Holmes replied. Or an adversary who disguised himself as one. Sir Alister, you will recall, was a barrister of reputation, and his recent cases have stirred considerable controversy. There are those who would gladly see his voice, his very advocacy, silenced. He paused by the desk, tapping the warped candle lightly. And what better irony for such a man than to die in silence, his last breath stolen by an unseen device of his own making? Lestrade frowned. His own making? Holmes nodded slowly. Indeed, consider this. Who better than Sir Alister himself to have constructed such a device? He possessed both the intellect and the privacy to do so. Perhaps he experimented, perhaps he intended only to test a theory or prepare a demonstration, a miscalculation, a timing error, and the mechanism betrayed him. I could not suppress a shiver. Then his death might be an accident? Holmes's eyes narrowed. It is a possibility, but an unsatisfactory one. If accident were the cause, the arrangement of the candles, the positioning of the portrait, the careful locking of the door, all would be inexplicable. No, Watson, the man's end was not spontaneous. It was staged, an experiment repurposed as murder. He turned suddenly, his energy rekindled. Come, there is one who can confirm my suspicion, the candlemaker. Higgins mentioned fetching the candle from the cabinet this evening. If we discover where the pair was purchased, we may find evidence of who last ordered them and for what purpose. Lestrade sighed. And you intend to wake a candlemaker at this hour? Holmes smiled faintly. Murder does not keep office hours, Lestrade. He reached for his coat and hat, gesturing for me to follow. Watson, bring your medical bag. We may require your instruments before dawn. As we stepped into the fog-laden street, the cold struck with renewed force, carrying with it the faint scent of coal smoke and damp stone. London was hushed, save for the occasional rattle of a distant carriage. Holmes moved briskly, his eyes fixed ahead, mind clearly occupied. "Do you see it, Watson?" he said as we turned into a narrower lane. "The elegance of the crime, the manipulation of silence itself. The murderer turned the house into an accomplice, the air into a blade. There is intellect here, but also vanity, and vanity, as you know, is a fatal flaw. We arrived at a dimly lit shop off Brompton Road, its windows clouded with waxy residue. The sign above read, H. Penworth and Sons, candlemakers to the gentry. Holmes rapped smartly upon the door. After some delay, a man in a soot-stained apron appeared, blinking in confusion. "At this hour, sir?" "I am Sherlock Holmes," said my companion briskly. "You supplied candles to Sir Alistair Darnaway of Knightsbridge?" The man blinked, then nodded slowly. "Aye, that we did. Finest beeswax pair. Special order." Holmes's voice sharpened. "Special in what regard?" The candlemaker frowned, thinking. "He sent the measurements himself, said he wanted the wax to burn with a low, steady flame, something about resonance and vibration, asked for the wick to be spun tight, not the usual sort of request." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me, then leaned forward. "Did he collect them personally?" "No, sir. A gentleman did, though not Sir Alistair. Left no name, but he was particular. Checked the weight of the wax and tested the burn himself. Said he was acting on Sir Alistair's behalf." "And his appearance?" Holmes pressed. "Tall, fair, clean-shaven, educated sort. Spoke precisely like a man used to giving orders." Holmes's expression hardened. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." As we stepped back into the fog, Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "A false messenger, Watson. The true hand enters the stage." He drew his collar close. We returned to Darnaway House. Before dawn, I must listen again, to the walls, to the air, and to the candle that remembered the scream. The carriage rattled through the mist-choked streets of London as the gaslights flickered past like dim, dying stars. Holmes sat opposite me, his head bowed and fingers steepled, his eyes half-lidded, yet burning with that peculiar brightness that always foretold a breakthrough forming somewhere in the recesses of his mind. I had long since learned to leave him to these silences. Interruptions, however well meant, only slowed the great machine of his reasoning. Yet tonight, the oppressive air of the city seemed to press upon even my composure, and at last I spoke. "You believe, then, that this fair-haired messenger who fetched the candles was the murderer himself?" Holmes's lips curved faintly, though his eyes remained closed. "I believe, Watson, that he is the missing note in an unfinished chord, a melody that, when played to its end, will reveal the entire orchestration. But whether he is the hand that struck the final blow, or merely the hand that wound the mechanism, that remains to be seen." Lestrade, who had dozed fitfully in the corner, stirred and muttered. "We've got dozens of fair-haired gents in London who give orders, Holmes. You'll need more than a wax stick and a whisper to hang this one." Holmes opened his eyes, fixing the inspector with a look that might have frozen a lesser man. "Lestrade, the evidence thus far is not meant for hanging, but for understanding. Until we understand the method, we cannot name the man. You quite naturally begin with persons, I with phenomena. Let us first know how Sir Alistair died, and the who will unmask itself as inevitably as dawn follows night." We reached Baker Street a little past 1 o'clock, the fog curling about the windows in slow, ghostly movements. Inside, Mrs. Hudson had long gone to bed, but Holmes moved with brisk precision, lighting the lamps and clearing a space upon the table. From his coat, he withdrew the warped candle and the metal cylinder from Darnaway House, setting both down beside a delicate array of instruments, lenses, tongs, and a small brass scale that glinted beneath the light. "Observe, Watson," he said, in that quiet, rapid tone which betrayed his excitement, "the candle's composition. Ordinary beeswax would burn evenly, but this has been infused with an additive, a trace of something volatile. You recall the rippled formation? It speaks not merely of air disturbed, but of chemical reaction. He scraped a thin layer from the edge, dropped it into a small dish, and applied a spark. The wax hissed faintly and released a sharp, acrid scent that caught in my throat. "Mercuric nitrate," Holmes declared, "a dangerous and unstable compound, highly unusual in candles but remarkably effective in responding to sudden changes of temperature or pressure. When exposed to a burst of heated gas, say a rush of air through a narrow conduit, it distorts, curls and hardens in precisely the pattern we observed." Lestrade leaned over the table, his brow furrowed. "And you're saying someone mixed this stuff into the candle? What for?" "To conceal the act of murder beneath the semblance of accident," Holmes replied. "Consider, Lestrade, an odourless gas released from behind the wall, enough to render the victim unconscious or dead within moments. The flame flickers, the candle warps, and all that remains is a baffling relic that no ordinary eye could interpret. The criminal is gone, the study locked, and the death appears both impossible and mundane." I felt a stir of unease as Holmes spoke. "But why such elaborate concealment, Holmes? Why not poison, or a pistol, or even a more conventional ruse?" He looked up sharply. "Because, my dear Watson, the murderer sought not only to kill but to prove. This was a demonstration, a work of design. There is pride in the method. The mechanism itself was the message." He turned his attention to the cylinder, examining its rim under the magnifier. A faint trace of oil shimmered in the lamplight. "You see this residue? Machine oil of the type used in precision instruments, not from the household, but from a workshop or laboratory. Whoever prepared this apparatus did so with care and professional tools." Holmes straightened suddenly, his entire demeanour shifting from contemplation to action. "Watson, we return to Darnaway House at once. The mechanism must still be there, hidden within the wall cavity behind the portrait. We have studied its effect. Now we must confront its source." The return journey passed in taut silence. Even Lestrade, who usually filled such intervals with practical objections, seemed subdued, as though he too sensed we were nearing the core of something extraordinary. The fog had thinned, and by the time we reached Knightsbridge, a wan light had begun to bleed into the eastern sky. The servants had been sent to rest, save for Bracken, who admitted us with a haggard expression. "Mr. Holmes," he whispered, "the house has been uneasy. Doors that were locked found ajar, and twice I thought I heard a step in the upper corridor, though none were abroad." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Excellent. Then our guest has not yet completed his visit." He strode directly to the study, motioning for silence. The room was as we had left it, though the air seemed colder, sharper. Holmes crossed to the portrait and lifted it carefully aside. "Watson, the lamp, if you please." I held it steady as he examined the aperture once more. His fingers brushed the interior surface, then stopped. "Fresh scoring," he murmured. "Someone has tampered with this since our last inspection." He reached deeper, producing a small metallic object, cylindrical and capped at one end with a threaded valve. "As I suspected, a miniature gas canister recently removed from its mounting." Lestrade whistled softly. "Then someone's been back to erase the evidence." "On the contrary," said Holmes, turning the object in his hand. "They came not to erase, but to replace. Observe, this valve has been reconnected, and traces of condensation remain. The device has been reloaded. Our culprit has returned to repeat his experiment." At that moment, a faint creak echoed from the hallway. Holmes froze, eyes narrowing, then gestured silently toward the door. The sound came again, measured, deliberate, He extinguished the lamp, plunging us into near darkness. "Quickly, Watson," he whispered, "to the side of the door. Lestrade, ready yourself." The latch turned with exquisite slowness. A sliver of pale dawn light spilled across the carpet, revealing the outline of a man stepping into the study. He moved cautiously, a dark overcoat drawn close, his features half obscured by the brim of his hat. He went straight to the desk and reached into his pocket for a key, the key to the closet. Holmes stepped forward, his voice low and razor-sharp. "I should advise against that, sir. You will find the experiment complete and the observers already in attendance." The man froze, his breath catching audibly. For a moment he stood rigid, then turned slowly toward us. The lamplight flared as Holmes struck a match, and the intruder's face came into view, handsome, intelligent, but cold with calculation. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Geoffrey Linley, if I'm not mistaken, the late Sir Alister's associate at Chambers." The man said nothing, only glanced once toward the portrait, where the hollow behind it now gaped like the mouth of some mechanical beast. The silence stretched, taut as wire. Then Holmes spoke again, softly, but with iron in his tone. "You see, Linley, the candle remembered more than a scream. It remembered the man who set the silence in motion." Linley's composure did not break, yet I saw the faint twitch of muscle at his temple, a betrayal of nerves too slight for most eyes, but not for Holmes. The silence in that room was suffocating. The candle's thin flame wavered, as though conscious of the tension now surrounding it. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Linley gave a cold, measured smile and said, "Mr. Holmes, you seem to have made a career out of appearing at the most inconvenient moments." Holmes regarded him with that peculiar mix of courtesy and quiet menace that could unnerve even the most hardened soul. "On the contrary, sir, I prefer to think I arrive precisely when I am most expected. The only difference lies in whether one greets me as ally or adversary." He took a step closer, eyes gleaming. "You came here tonight to adjust the mechanism behind that wall, perhaps to remove what evidence remained, or perhaps to test it again. Either way, the presence of a loaded cylinder in your pocket tells us enough." Linley's hand, which had been half hidden within his overcoat, froze. Lestrade reacted swiftly, stepping forward and seizing his wrist. With a sharp motion, he pulled free a small brass tube capped at one end, identical to the one Holmes had already recovered. Linley's expression did not alter, but his voice grew icily calm. "That, Inspector, is part of Sir Alister's experiment. I came merely to secure it for his estate." Holmes smiled faintly, the gesture devoid of warmth. "You will forgive me if I doubt your sudden interest in probate formalities at 2 o'clock in the morning." He turned the cylinder over in his hand, then sniffed at the valve. "Ah, chloroform vapor? A convenient choice. Odorless in minute quantities, fatal in confined space, and quick to dissipate. You see, Watson, how science can lend even murder a kind of elegance." Lestrade looked grim. "So that's how he did it? Released this gas through the wall?" "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And our friend here came to ensure no one discovered the means. Tell me, Mr. Linley, was it jealousy, debt, or ambition that drove you? The man you served as colleague and rival was found dead in a locked room, his supposed friend standing to inherit both his cases and his reputation. A curious coincidence, is it not?" Linley's jaw tightened. "You overreach, Mr. Holmes. Sir Alister and I were partners. He designed that apparatus himself. A foolish indulgence. I warned him of the risks. When he failed to respond to my letters this week, I feared precisely this outcome." Holmes regarded him steadily. "An admirable attempt at preemption, but you have miscalculated your timeline. Sir Alistair's death occurred scarcely 3 hours before your arrival. The candle still remembers, as does the air of this room. No man can fear an accident that has not yet happened, unless he has planned it." Linley said nothing. His gaze flicked once toward the door, but Lestrade shifted subtly, blocking his path. Holmes's tone grew quieter, almost conversational, though his eyes never left the man's face. "You made one fatal error, Mr. Linley. You assumed your device would erase every trace, that silence and chemistry together would conspire to bury the truth. Yet you forgot that every system, however perfect, leaves a signature: the warped wax, the asymmetric air pattern, the misalignment of ash upon the hearth, all small, all sufficient." For the first time, Linley's composure cracked. He exhaled sharply and turned his gaze to the portrait leaning against the wainscot. "You speak as though you understand everything, Holmes, yet you grasp only fragments. You think me a killer, but what if I merely corrected a mistake that would have killed others?" Holmes's head inclined slightly. "Enlighten us, then." Linley hesitated, then spoke in a low, urgent tone. "Sir Alistair was obsessed with proving that sound could travel through structure as energy, resonant frequencies he called them. He built that mechanism not to kill but to demonstrate, a candle flame responding to invisible vibrations. But the experiment evolved. He realized he could channel not only sound but pressure, gases, if compressed through the same design. I warned him it was dangerous. He refused to listen. I feared he'd kill himself, or worse, others in this house. So yes, I came tonight to dismantle what remained before it was discovered." Holmes listened intently, hands clasped behind his back. When Linley finished, there was a silence broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. "A fascinating narrative," Holmes said finally. "But it suffers from one defect. It cannot coexist with the facts." Linley's voice sharpened. "And what facts are those?" Holmes moved to the desk and pointed to the blotched page upon which Sir Alistair's final lines still lingered beneath the heavy smear of ink. "You see, the good baronet had just begun to write. We recovered enough to reconstruct the letters beneath. It reads, 'Lin,' and ends in the blot. Hardly the prelude to a scientific note, wouldn't you say?" Lestrade's eyes widened. "He was writing your name." Linley's face turned ashen. "Coincidence. Pure coincidence. He could have written any number of things." Holmes leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the room. "No coincidence writes itself in a locked room, sir. You lured him here under the pretense of testing his design, released the vapor through the conduit when he bent to adjust the candle, and watched as his own experiment took his life. Then you locked the door from the inside with a second key, one we have just recovered from your pocket." At that, Linley's hand twitched involuntarily toward his coat again, but Lestrade was quicker, snapping a pair of cuffs around his wrists with a metallic click. "That's quite enough, Mr. Linley. You can tell the rest to the yard." Holmes's expression softened slightly as he turned to me. "There, Watson, lies the tragedy of intellect without conscience. The man sought to prove a principle and, finding it successful, sought also to claim it by force. Science, like art, demands humility, or it becomes a weapon." As Linley was led away, the first pale light of dawn seeped through the curtains, casting the study in an eerie calm. The warped candle still lay upon the desk, its frozen ripples gleaming faintly in the morning glow. I looked at it and shuddered. "It seems almost alive," I said quietly, "as though it truly did remember what happened here." Holmes gave a faint smile and placed a hand on my shoulder. "In a sense, Watson, it does. Every event leaves its mark upon matter, just as every crime leaves its echo upon the soul. The art of detection lies merely in listening to both. He turned toward the door, coat collar drawn up against the chill, and added softly, "Come, my dear fellow, the candle has spoken, and the night has given up its secret. Let us leave this house to its silence once more." The morning after Linley's arrest dawned bleak and pale, the fog lingering low over Baker Street like the ghost of the night before. The city had yet to stir fully from its slumber, but within our sitting room a quiet energy vibrated beneath the surface. Holmes sat at the window, his long fingers drumming against the arm of his chair, eyes distant and unfocused, yet his entire being radiated thought. He had not slept. I, meanwhile, had done little better, haunted by the image of Sir Alister's lifeless figure and the warped candle that seemed to hold the room's final breath. I busied myself with the morning paper, though my mind was far from its printed lines. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly without turning his head, "do you know what troubles me about Linley's confession?" I looked up, startled. Confession? But he made none. "Precisely," said Holmes, rising in a fluid motion. "And yet every word he did speak carried the odour of evasion. His tale of scientific caution, his claim of attempting to dismantle the device, all too conveniently aligned with the facts he knew we could verify. He told us only enough to seem plausible. I frowned. You think his story false, then? Not false, incomplete, Holmes replied. He began pacing before the fire, his dressing gown swirling about him. A confession built upon partial truth is far more dangerous than an outright lie. It grants credibility to deceit. Linley may indeed have warned Sir Alister of the experiment's risks. He may have feared its consequences, but there remains something unaccounted for, something more personal, more pressing that drove him to act when he did. I followed his reasoning, though with growing unease. You mean another motive? Just so, his professional rivalry explains ambition, but not obsession. Why return to the scene after the deed was done? Why risk discovery? A murderer acting from greed or fear would flee, not revisit the corpse of his crime. No, Watson, he returned, because something was left unfinished. Before I could reply, a firm knock sounded below, followed by Mrs. Hudson's hurried steps, and a moment later the opening of our door. Inspector Lestrade entered, his coat damp with mist, his expression one of irritation mingled with fatigue. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. I hope you're satisfied. Linley's in custody, the Yard's got the apparatus, and the newspapers will have their mystery solved before noon. Scientific murder in Knightsbridge, they're calling it already." Holmes regarded him with mild amusement. "Ah, the appetite of the public for premature conclusions never fails to delight me," Lestrade frowned. "You've doubts still?" "Good Lord, Holmes, we found the man in the act, the cylinder in his pocket, and his name half written by the victim's own hand. What more would you want?" Holmes tilted his head. "A motive that fits the melody, Inspector. One cannot end a symphony with a single discordant note and call it complete." Lestrade groaned softly. "There's always something with you, isn't there? Well, the Yard's content if you aren't. They'll charge him by noon." "By noon," Holmes repeated thoughtfully. "How curious." He crossed to his desk, seized his coat, and gestured for me to follow. "Come, Watson, a stroll before breakfast, I think." Lestrade threw up his hands. "Where to now?" "To the prison," said Holmes. "If Mr. Linley is the man I believe him to be, he has not yet finished speaking." Within the hour we were seated across from Geoffrey Linley in a narrow cell at Bow Street. The pale morning light filtered through the barred window, falling upon his face, which appeared drawn but strangely resolute. Holmes studied him silently for a long moment before speaking. "You've had a night to reflect?" he said at last. Reflection is a treacherous companion. It has a way of whispering truths one would rather not hear. Linley's eyes flickered. I've said all I intend to. Indeed, Holmes murmured. Then you will not mind if I fill in what you omitted. He leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but precise. You spoke yesterday of fear. Fear that Sir Alistair's experiment would end in tragedy. Yet you returned not to destroy the device, but to replace it. The cylinder in your pocket was newly filled. You meant to activate it again. Linley's expression tightened. That's absurd. Is it? Holmes's tone remained light. Then why bring a loaded canister instead of tools for dismantling? Why return through a servant's passage instead of the front door? And why, above all, carry in your coat a letter, addressed but not sent, to a woman named Eveline Darnaway? At that, Linley's composure faltered visibly. I saw his lips part, then close again as though he'd bitten back words. Holmes pressed gently, like a surgeon exposing a wound. Eveline Darnaway, Sir Alistair's estranged sister, long absent from London but not from your affections. The letter, half burnt though it was, spoke volumes. If he stands in our way again, you wrote, I shall have no choice but to act. A sentimental declaration, but one the law interprets harshly. Linley's hands clenched upon the table. You found that letter? Holmes's eyes gleamed. In your desk at Chambers, where even the dust confided its secrets. You see, I am not the only one who listens to what the inanimate world remembers. For a long moment, Linley said nothing. Then, in a voice low and tremulous, he murmured, He ruined her, Holmes. Drove her from society with his cold pride, disinherited her when she chose me. She lived abroad, penniless, while he flourished. When she died, alone, I swore he would answer for it. Holmes's voice softened, though his gaze remained fixed. Revenge, then. Dressed in the robes of justice, you wished him to die by the very invention that symbolized his intellect, his vanity, to silence him in the silence he himself created. Linley bowed his head. He took everything. I only took it back. Lestrade exhaled sharply. You'll hang for it, Linley. Holmes raised a hand. That is for the courts, not for us. He turned to the inspector. You see now, Lestrade, how partial truth concealed the greater one. A mechanical device explains how, but only passion explains why. The law punishes the act, but I confess, the tragedy of it almost demands a poet's lament. As we left the cell, the first full light of morning broke through the clouded sky, gilding the stone corridor with thin gold. Holmes paused at the threshold, his expression distant, reflective. There are two kinds of silence, Watson, he said quietly. The silence imposed by science, and the silence imposed by grief. Both can kill with equal certainty. He stepped into the open air, where the city was stirring to life once more. The mist had begun to lift, and for the first time that day I thought I saw a trace of warmth in the faint sunlight that touched the brim of his hat as he strode ahead into the waking London streets. We had scarcely returned to Baker Street when I saw the faintest trace of unease cross Holmes's countenance, an expression so rare that it arrested my attention at once. He tossed his hat onto the rack, yet his movements lacked their usual deliberation. For a few moments he said nothing, only stood by the fire, staring into the embers as if the case itself were concealed within them. "It is never the confession, Watson," he said at last, his voice low. "It is the silence that follows it which unsettles me." I set down my walking stick, still chilled from the damp air outside. "You've solved the case, Holmes. Linley's guilt is undeniable. Surely that should bring satisfaction rather than disquiet." He gave a short, humourless laugh. "Ah, satisfaction is a poor companion to truth, my dear fellow. We have the culprit, yes, but something in this affair refuses to rest. Consider, if Linley's motive was revenge, why engineer a mechanism of such delicacy and precision? Why not a simple pistol, a drop of laudanum, or any of the countless methods at a murderer's disposal? Why a candle that remembers a scream?" I frowned, because he wished the death to appear accidental, to humiliate his victim intellectually, perhaps? Holmes shook his head. "No, that is too romantic. Linley is a man of logic. His crime, though born of passion, was executed with science. Yet the more I consider it, the less it fits him. There is too much refinement in the contrivance, too much patience in its construction. Linley may have planned the act, but I do not believe he built the device." I was about to respond when a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, announcing a visitor, a young man, pale and anxious, who carried under his arm a small, leather-bound case. He bowed stiffly upon entering. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, my name is Caleb Penworth. I am the son of Henry Penworth, the candlemaker you visited 2 nights past." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden interest. "Ah, yes, the craftsman of our fateful wax." He motioned to a chair. "Please, Mr. Penworth, be seated." "You have the air of one burdened with news." The young man hesitated before speaking. "Sir, my father bade me come at once. He has been disturbed since your visit. After you left, he recalled something unusual about the order Sir Alistair placed. It was not the first time those specifications were requested." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." 2 months prior," Penworth continued, "a gentleman ordered an identical pair. Same dimensions, same wax mixture, same reinforced wick. My father assumed it was another of Sir Alistair's commissions, for the man mentioned his name, but now he believes he was deceived. The description matches that of the same fair-haired man you spoke of, the one who fetched the candles." Holmes's fingers steepled instantly. "And your father recalls no name?" "None, sir. Only that the man paid in cash and was precise to the point of obsession about the formula. He also requested that no record be kept." "Ah," Holmes murmured, rising from his chair. "Then the ghost of the experiment extends further than even our imprisoned friend suspected." He began pacing the room, his eyes alight with energy. "Watson, do you see? The device may not have been conceived by Sir Alistair at all. What if he was only one participant in a larger design, a design shared by another mind entirely?" Lestrade, who had joined us shortly after, folded his arms sceptically. "You mean to tell me there's another culprit still at large, Holmes? We've got the man, and his motives clear as daylight." Holmes turned sharply. "Daylight can blind as easily as it illuminates, Lestrade. Linley built upon another's foundation. He exploited a system already in place, an apparatus designed not for murder, but for demonstration. Someone else constructed it. Someone who understood acoustics, air pressure, and combustion to an extraordinary degree." I felt a stir of unease. "Then you believe this second figure may have guided both men?" "Possibly," Holmes said, "or merely used them to test an invention. Remember what Linley said, Sir Alistair's obsession with resonance. It is conceivable that both men were engaged in a joint study of sound transmission, perhaps under the guidance of a third collaborator whose identity has yet to surface. If that person now realizes the device's role in murder, he may well seek to reclaim it or destroy it." As if summoned by the thought, a faint sound drifted from the street below, a carriage halting abruptly, followed by hurried footsteps. Holmes crossed to the window and drew the curtain a fraction aside. "Watson," he whispered, Observe. A man stands at the opposite corner, tall, muffled in a dark greatcoat. He has remained there since Penworth entered. I moved closer, but the mist obscured the figure. Do you recognize him? Holmes's voice was taut. Not yet, but whoever he is, he watches us with the patience of one accustomed to waiting for an opportunity. He turned briskly. Lestrade, take a man from the yard and have him shadow that fellow, discreetly. We shall not confront him until he commits to action. Lestrade left at once, muttering about Holmes's fondness for spectres. Meanwhile, Holmes resumed his seat, though the restless gleam in his eyes betrayed the feverish motion of his thoughts. Watson, there is something else in this matter, something beyond revenge or rivalry. A scientific device of such design could command high interest among those who trade in intelligence, particularly in matters of sound and communication. I blinked. You mean espionage? Perhaps, Holmes said gravely. Or perhaps something subtler, a weapon disguised as experiment. Imagine, Watson, a mechanism capable of transmitting vibration across walls, carrying messages or destroying evidence without a trace. Such knowledge would tempt not only the criminal but the statesman. Before I could answer, another knock sounded, urgent, insistent. Mrs. Hudson appeared once more, pale. A note for you, Mr. Holmes. The messenger would not give his name. Holmes took the folded paper and broke the seal. I saw his expression tighten as he read. Without a word, he handed it to me. The handwriting was neat, deliberate. To interfere further is to endanger those around you. The candle burned once, it can burn again. A chill crept through me. Holmes, this? Yes, he said quietly. A warning and a promise. He looked toward the window, where the fog pressed like a living veil. The hand behind the candle still moves, Watson. Linley's act was only the overture. The true composer remains unseen and intends another performance. He straightened abruptly, the languor gone from his frame. Pack your revolver, my dear fellow. We are not yet done with Darnaway House. Before this day ends, we shall learn whether the candle remembers only a scream or can be made to echo it again. The fog thickened as we made our way back to Knightsbridge, wrapping itself around the cab like a living shroud. The horse's hooves clopped hollowly against the wet stones, the sound muffled in the dense air. Holmes sat rigid beside me, his profile drawn in hard lines, his gaze fixed on some point that existed only in the intricate corridors of his mind. The note's threat had disturbed me deeply, but it seemed to rouse in him a kind of grim exhilaration, a renewal of purpose, as though the warning were proof that the enemy still played the game. He spoke at last, his tone clipped and quiet. Watson, the author of that note possesses both courage and precision. He understands the significance of symbolism. The candle burned once, it can burn again. Not merely a threat, but a promise of repetition. He intends to reconstruct the conditions of the first crime. That, my dear fellow, gives us the advantage. I turned toward him. Then you believe another murder is imminent? I believe, Holmes said when awed, that our adversary is compelled by something far beyond mere concealment. The first death was both an experiment and a message. The second, if permitted, will be the conclusion of his design. We must ensure that he never reaches that finale. When we arrived, Darnaway House loomed from the mist like a tomb unearthed before its time. A faint light glimmered in one of the upper windows. Lestrade, who had preceded us, stepped out from the doorway, his breath visible in the chill air. We've kept the house under watch, Holmes. The man who followed your candlemaker's son has not reappeared. All's quiet within. Too quiet, Holmes murmured, brushing past him. That inspector is often the loudest of all alarms. Inside, the air retained its peculiar stillness, a sensation I could almost feel pressing against my skin. Holmes motioned for silence and ascended the staircase, his lantern held low, the beams sweeping across portraits that seemed to watch us with uneasy intelligence. The study door creaked faintly as he pushed it open, revealing the familiar scene. The desk, the extinguished candle, the portrait still leaning against the wainscot. But now there was something different. The faintest scent of oil hung in the air, and the dust around the hearth had been disturbed. Holmes's expression sharpened. "He has been here?" Lestrade moved forward cautiously. "When?" "Within the past hour, perhaps less." Holmes crossed to the desk and placed his hand against the wood. Still warm, the intruder lit a candle, or several, and extinguished them before leaving. "Observe the tiny droplets of fresh wax here, and the soot upon the rim of the candlestick." I leaned closer and saw the fine trace of black residue, as though something had been hastily removed. Holmes bent to the aperture behind the portrait, his fingers moving lightly over the inner wall. "The mechanism has been altered. Note how the edge of the opening has been widened, and the inner metal lining replaced. He has rebuilt the conduit. The experiment is prepared anew." A cold unease gripped me. "Then he means to use it again, perhaps tonight." Holmes's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not tonight, Watson. Now. The device is set to trigger upon the next lighting of the candles. He has laid the trap and waits, somewhere close, to observe its success." He turned abruptly to Lestrade. "Station your men at every exit. No one enters or leaves without my command. The killer is near, perhaps within these walls." Lestrade obeyed without question. I watched as Holmes examined the room once more, his every movement taut with concentration. He took up the warped candle, the one that had remembered the scream, and placed it upon the desk beside its still companion. Then from his pocket he withdrew the second cylinder we had recovered from Linley. "Observe, Watson," he said softly. "Identical in form to the one used before, but this contains no poison. It contains air compressed at high pressure. The murderer would not expect that substitution. If he attempts to activate his device, he will expose himself instead of his victim." I caught my breath. "You mean to draw him out by triggering the mechanism yourself?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Precisely. There are few instruments more eloquent than one's own trap turned upon its maker." He struck a match and lit the first candle. Its flame rose steady and pale, casting tremulous shadows upon the walls. The second followed, its light merging with the first to fill the room with a golden flicker. Holmes stood beside the desk, his eyes darting between the portrait and the narrow aperture. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence deepened until I could hear the faint ticking of my own heartbeat. Then, very softly, a sound reached us, a faint, metallic whisper from behind the wall, like the sigh of a distant bellows. Holmes's hand shot out. "Watson, the lamp! Dim it, quickly!" I obeyed, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the flicker of the two candles. Holmes moved toward the wall, his shadow stretching monstrously across it. The faint whisper grew into a steady hiss. I caught the faintest glint of moisture upon the wallpaper. Condensation. Something was indeed being released within. Suddenly a voice spoke from the doorway, calm and deliberate. "Step away, Mr. Holmes. If you value your lives, extinguish those flames at once." We turned. A tall figure stood silhouetted against the dim corridor light. He was wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but his voice, measured, cultured, utterly without fear, carried the weight of authority. Holmes did not move. "So the composer reveals himself at last," he said softly, "You must forgive my curiosity, sir, but your handwriting preceded you." The stranger stepped forward, his hand inside his coat. "Curiosity is fatal, Mr. Holmes. You should have left the candle unremembered." Holmes's tone sharpened. "And yet it is you who returned to ensure its memory was wiped clean." "I should have known. The method bore too much precision for Linley's hand. You are the true architect, the scientist behind the instrument." The man smiled faintly. "Architect, yes. Murderer, no. The device was conceived for communication. Sound transmitted through vibration. An idea Sir Alistair stole from me. He turned it into vanity, Linley into vengeance. I merely came to erase my name from their folly." Holmes's voice dropped to a warning whisper. "Then you have come too late. You see that cylinder upon the desk? It no longer contains your deadly concoction, but air, and it has already been engaged. Within moments the pressure will reverse. The wall will exhale instead of inhale." The stranger's expression shifted, his confidence faltering. "You're bluffing!" Holmes took a step back, gesturing to the aperture. "Am I?" The hiss deepened into a shudder. A burst of vapour escaped through the opening with a low hiss, scattering the candlelight into spectral waves. The man lunged forward, but Lestrade appeared from behind the doorframe, revolver drawn. "Not another step," he barked. The intruder froze, eyes darting between Holmes and the wall. "You've destroyed it," he spat. "Do you have any idea what you've done? Years of work, gone." Holmes regarded him coolly. "I have a fair notion. You've built a whispering death, sir, a machine that kills in silence. The world can do without such genius." The man gave a low, bitter laugh. "You call it death, Holmes. I call it progress." Holmes's gaze did not waver. "Progress, like fire, is admirable, so long as one remembers who gets burned." The hiss subsided, and the air in the room grew still again. The man's shoulders sagged as Lestrade stepped forward to place him under arrest. As he was led away, Holmes turned to the candles, their flames still trembling in the aftermath of what had nearly been unleashed. He bent low, extinguishing them with a single breath. The darkness that followed was absolute. "Watson," he said quietly, "remember this. Even light, when misused, can summon shadow." I could not speak. In the dim stillness of that room, I felt again the echo of the unseen scream the candle had once remembered, and the haunting realization that in silence lay the most dangerous sound of all. The dawn that followed was one of those pale, reluctant mornings when London seems to resist waking, as though the fog itself were weary of the sins it had witnessed. The events of the night lingered with me like a fever dream. The hiss of air, the quivering candlelight, the face of that cold-eyed inventor, caught between pride and ruin. Yet Holmes, even after the man had been led away by Lestrade, had shown no triumph, no satisfaction. He had remained in the silent study of Darnaway House long after the rest of us had gone, seated at Sir Alistair's desk, the extinguished candles before him, staring into nothing. When at last we returned to Baker Street, the world outside had begun to stir with the first wagons of the morning milkman. Holmes flung himself into his chair and stared into the empty grate as if the dying embers still whispered secrets. His pipe, unlit, hung loosely from his fingers. "You see, Watson," he said after a long silence, "the true danger of intellect lies not in ignorance, but in mastery. When a man learns to control silence itself, he fancies himself a god." I poured him a cup of tea, which he ignored. "I confess, Holmes," I said, "I still do not entirely understand that man's purpose. He claimed to have built the mechanism for communication, not destruction." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and therein lies the irony. His device, properly employed, might have carried sound across rooms, perhaps even distances, a marvel of science. But when ambition and envy entered the equation, what might have been a bridge between minds became instead a chasm between lives. Sir Alistair used the invention for acclaim, Linley for revenge, and our anonymous architect for erasure. Each thought himself righteous. Each was, in his own way, wrong. He rose suddenly, restless as ever, and crossed to the window. The fog was lifting now, revealing the outline of the city in the growing light. "Yet," he said softly, "there remains a thread. That man did not act alone. The design of such precision required assistance, someone with access, perhaps even someone within Darnaway House itself." I started. "But Holmes, surely the matter is concluded. The architect has been captured. Linley confessed his guilt. What remains?" Holmes turned, his expression unreadable. "The human element, Watson. Always that. Do you remember the portrait above the desk, the one that concealed the aperture?" "Of course." "There was an inconsistency," he said. "The dust upon the frame had been disturbed in a manner inconsistent with the rest of the wall, not merely from recent removal, but from frequent adjustment. Someone had been tampering with it long before Sir Alistair's death, someone who entered that room often and unnoticed, and considered the mechanism itself delicate, precise, hidden within the wall. It could not have been installed without cooperation from within the household." "You suspect one of the servants?" "Perhaps," he said, his eyes narrowing, "but not in the ordinary sense of guilt. An accomplice who did not understand the full scope of their actions, merely followed instruction." He reached for his coat once more. "Come, Watson, we return to Darnaway House. There are questions I neglected to ask." The journey back was swift. The house stood now under official seal, yet Lestrade, still present for his final inspection, waved us through with a grumble. Holmes wasted no words, ascending at once to the study. The morning light made the room appear almost ordinary now, stripped of its nocturnal menace, yet the scent of oil and smoke lingered faintly still. Holmes called for the butler, Fenwick, a stooped man whose measured composure had struck me before as almost unnatural. He entered, his face pale but steady. Holmes regarded him in silence for a moment before speaking. "Mr. Fenwick, during our last examination you mentioned that Sir Alistair kept his deeds and cigars within the closet adjoining this room. Tell me who last repaired the plastering along the inner wall." The man blinked. Why, I did, sir. Some months ago, the baronet requested that a small passage be resealed. I recall it because he insisted the work be done privately, without tradesmen." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "Privately. And what materials did you use?" "Only plaster, sir, as provided, though—" He hesitated. "The architect, the gentleman who visited, he oversaw it, gave me very particular directions." "Ah." Holmes's tone grew soft. "And were you compensated for your assistance?" Fenwick looked down. "He paid me handsomely, sir. I thought no harm. He said it was a speaking tube, some new invention." Holmes stepped closer, his eyes keen. "And after the baronet's death, did this same man contact you again?" The butler hesitated. "He did, sir, last evening. A note delivered by hand asking that I leave the side door unlatched. He said he wished to retrieve something left behind by Sir Alistair." Lestrade, who had entered behind us, let out a low whistle. "So that's how he got in?" Holmes nodded. "Indeed, the experiment, Watson, could not have succeeded without one last human instrument, the servant who opened the way." He regarded Fenwick not unkindly. "You have been a pawn in a game of intellect and deceit, my good man. But rest assured, no blame will befall you. Your unwitting hand may have opened the door to a murderer, but it also provided the clue that closed it. Fenwick bowed his head, relief mingled with shame. "Thank you, sir. I did not understand." "No," Holmes said quietly. "Few do." He turned back to the desk, where the two candles remained as relics of the night's terror. He lifted the warped one, holding it up to the light. "Strange, is it not, Watson, that a simple candle should bear witness to such a web of ambition, pride, and folly? It remembered a scream, yes, but it also remembered every hand that lit it." As we left the room, I looked back once more. The morning sun filtered through the mist, caught the polished edge of the desk, and cast a faint gleam upon the candle's surface. For a moment it seemed almost to glow, as though aware of its own history. On our return to Baker Street, Holmes at last allowed himself a measure of repose. He sank into his chair, eyes half closed, the faintest wisp of smoke curling upward from his freshly lit pipe. "You see, Watson," he said at length, "the science of deduction is much like that candle. It illuminates, yes, but it also consumes. Each case, each puzzle, burns a little of one's own substance." I smiled wearily. "Then may it never extinguish, my dear Holmes." He glanced at me then, and for the briefest moment there was warmth in his eyes, a flicker of humanity beneath the brilliance. "Ah, my good Watson," he murmured, "if ever it does, let us hope there remains someone with a steady enough hand to remember the flame." The fire crackled softly, and the last of the night's darkness lifted beyond the window. And though the case of the candle that remembered a scream was at last laid to rest, I could not shake the feeling that somewhere in the silence of the city another whisper waited, ready to be heard by the one man who could listen to what others never could. The evening that followed was one of rare tranquillity at Baker Street. The rain had cleared, leaving a crystalline sheen upon the cobbles outside, and the city hummed with its familiar, distant rhythm. Holmes had spent much of the day in quiet reflection, moving between his armchair, the chemical table, and the window with the air of a man retracing invisible patterns in his mind. The warped candle, now little more than a relic of wax and soot, rested upon the mantel, its distorted form a silent testament to the case that had consumed us for so many restless nights. "It is curious, Watson," he said at last, breaking the long silence, "how the most brilliant of inventions so often become instruments of destruction. The mind that conceives beauty is so frequently the same that births calamity. In this, our candle serves as both metaphor and warning." I set aside my notes, sensing that he was, in his own way, approaching the summation of the entire affair. "And yet," I said, "it was not the invention itself that killed, but the hands that wielded it." Holmes smiled faintly. "A subtle distinction, but an important one. You see, the device, the silent conduit, as our so-called architect termed it, was no more murderous than a pistol in its holster. It was vanity, vengeance, and fear that loaded the chamber. Sir Alistair sought glory, Linley sought revenge, and our final adversary, the architect, sought erasure, an obliteration of his own culpability in what his genius had made possible. Three men, each staring into the same flame, each seeing a different reflection." He rose and crossed to the mantel, taking up the warped candle between his long fingers. "This object, my dear fellow, will tell no more tales, and yet within it lies the perfect symmetry of cause and consequence. Its surface bears the record of every vibration, every whisper of air, every breath taken and silenced in that ill-fated room. The world may call it coincidence, but I have learned that even silence remembers." He replaced the candle gently, then turned toward me with that familiar glint of energy, the light of a mind already racing beyond the conclusion. "You recall, Watson, how I spoke of the dust upon the portrait's frame?" It was the smallest of things, but it was the beginning of everything. A man's character is revealed not in his grand gestures, but in the details he overlooks. From that smudge of dust to the trace of mercuric nitrate upon the wax, the path was as clear as a line drawn in light. I smiled, unable to hide my admiration. And yet you claim not to believe in fate, Holmes. Fate? He repeated with a wry expression. No, my dear fellow, not fate. Pattern. The universe is composed of it. The human soul merely imitates it, sometimes to creation, sometimes to ruin. A soft knock interrupted our conversation. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing the Evening Post. Holmes took a small envelope from the tray, its seal unmarked, its paper of high quality. He examined it briefly, then passed it to me. "Open it, Watson. My fingers are weary of correspondence." I did as he asked. Inside lay a single sheet, upon which was written in a neat, deliberate hand, "Some candles burn longer than others, Mr. Holmes. The light fades, but the shadow remains. Until we meet again." There was no signature. I looked up, startled. "You don't mean—" Holmes waved a hand, dismissively, though I caught the faint tightening around his eyes. Our imprisoned inventor has friends, or perhaps imitators. The mind that seeks to control silence rarely finds peace within it. "But fear not, Watson. Shadows, like lies, cannot endure the daylight forever." He dropped into his chair once more, the faintest curl of smoke rising from his freshly lit pipe. "Let them burn their candles if they wish. The lesson, I think, remains the same." "And what lesson is that, Holmes?" He smiled, a rare, almost human warmth touching his features. "That knowledge, like fire, demands reverence, and that even a whisper, if forgotten, may one day be heard again." For a time, neither of us spoke. The lamps burned low, the night deepened, and the city's pulse softened into the rhythm of sleep. I gazed at my companion, his sharp profile outlined against the dim glow, his expression distant, yet peaceful, and thought how strange it was that a man who trafficked so constantly in the logic of crime could still find solace in the quiet aftermath of justice. At length he rose, crossing to the window. "You see, Watson," he said softly, "the world is never truly silent. Even now the wind carries the faintest echo of a scream that once was. But as long as one candle burns, there is light enough to find the truth." He drew the curtain closed, and the fog swallowed the last of the street lamps. The case of the candle that remembered a scream was over, yet its flame lingered still, in the flicker of the hearth, in the reflection of Holmes's keen eyes, and in the knowledge that though men may strive to command silence, truth forever finds its voice,